In a palace of wolves, silence is the lowest rank. Vera had not spoken in 14 years. Mute since the age of 4, raised on a kitchen floor by old Magga, the palace baker, who had pulled her from somewhere she never explained and never repeated. Vera was the lowest omega in Silvercrown Palace. No wolf, no family name, no place at any table in the servants' hall. The kind of invisible that meant no one looked at her face when she set a tray down. The Alpha King's twin pups had been screaming for 12 days straight. Their father was dead. Prince Kale, the king's younger brother, brought back from the eastern woods with his throat torn, and his 8-month-old pups, Arza and Eli, had not stopped howling since his heart stopped. 3 healers had failed. The court witch had failed. 2 wet nurses had been dismissed in tears, one with bite marks from the pup's milk teeth. The sound came through 4 flights of stone and filled every room in the palace with a pressure that would not let up. On the 12th night, every servant in the kitchen pressed against the far wall with their hands over their ears, and Magga pushed a tray of warm milk across the table toward the only person in the room with no rank left to lose. Vera picked up the milk, steadied the cup with her thumb, and climbed. The back stairs ran behind the Great Hall's service corridor, and on the 12th night, the Great Hall was full. Not for celebration. The court had gathered because no one could sleep. The east wing was uninhabitable, and Councillor Dressed, the king's uncle, white-haired and wide across the shoulders, the man who had held the silver-crowned seal longer than Lucan had been alive, had called an informal session to discuss the pup situation. Half the court wore nightclothes. The other half wore light armor, because wolves who could not sleep grew unpredictable in ways that benefited no one. Vera should have passed straight through the corridor without stopping. The stairwell door was 20 paces past the servants' arch, but the arch opened directly onto the hall, and Lady Nesta, Dressed daughter, copper-haired, straight-backed, the woman the council had been grooming as Lucan's intended for 3 years, was standing in it with a wine cup. She saw the tray, then Vera. The mute. The words cut across the hall, heads turned. Magga sent the mute to the nursery. Vera adjusted her grip on the tray and kept walking. Stop. Nesta's hand closed on her shoulder through the wool of her kitchen dress, and 2 of Nesta's women stepped behind her, close enough that Vera could feel their breathing on the back of her neck. The hall was watching. All of it. Councillor Dressed at the high table with his chin on his fist and his eyes half-lidded, a posture he wore when he wanted to appear bored while missing nothing. The court witch on the bench near the cold fireplace with her bowl of ash. 6 household guards along the far wall. A dozen courtiers in varying stages of sleepless misery. 4 servants frozen near the wine table. Every face fixed on the servants' arch where Vera stood with a tray of milk and a noblewoman's fingers digging into her shoulder. 3 royal healers. Nesta's voice was pitched to carry, bright and sharp and aimed at the room. A court witch, 2 northern wet nurses who trained for precisely this. She turned Vera so the hall could see her, the stained kitchen dress, the flour dusted on her wrists, the bare feet because Omega kitchen servants did not rank high enough for shoes. And Magga's solution is a girl who cannot scream for help when the pups bite her. A scatter of tired laughter, the kind that needed a target. Vera's chest tightened, not from the words, she had been called worse by better, but the flour on her wrists was visible from the high table, and that meant every wolf in the hall was cataloguing exactly what she was. The kitchen floor, the back stairs, the lowest rung. Her face stayed neutral, her hands stayed level, the milk did not move. That was the only dignity available when you stood at the bottom. Stillness. Do you even know what a soul anchor is? Nesta leaned closer. She smelled of jasmine, and underneath it something copper and sour, the scent of a she-wolf who had not slept in 12 days. Do you know what those pups lost? What is draining out of their bodies right now while you carry warm milk up the stairs? Vera knew. Everyone knew. The soul anchor was the resonance bond between wolf-born infants and a living parent, the signal that told the pups' wolves it was safe to stay inside their bodies. Kale had been that anchor. His death had severed it. Without a replacement from the maternal bloodline, the pups would untether completely within the month. They were not crying from pain or hunger. They were crying because they were coming apart from the inside, and warm milk was exactly as useless as Nesta said it was. But Magga had sent it, and Magga did not do things without reason. She probably thinks it will help. Nesta lifted the cup from the tray, held it up for the room to see, and turned it over. The milk hit the stone floor, white spreading over grey. The wet sound of it carried a small, specific slap in a hall full of people who said nothing. The cup bounced once, rolled in a slow arc, and came to rest against Vera's ankle. She watched the milk pool between her bare feet and stain the hem of her dress. 12 years of carrying trays through halls that did not see her. This was not the worst thing that had happened on the back stairs, not the worst thing this month. She bent down and picked up the cup and set it back on the tray. One motion, steady hands, no pause. Then she walked to the kitchen arch, took the spare cup from the stone ledge where Magga always kept a backup, because Magga had survived 3 kings and understood that nothing in a wolf palace went according to plan, so you kept 2 of everything and placed it on the saucer without stopping. The hall watched her do this. No sound, no reaction on her face, an Omega maid replacing the pieces because that was what Omega maids did when pieces were broken. But at the high table, Councillor Drest's eyes followed the second cup onto the tray. His expression did not change. His fingers did. They pressed harder into his chin, a fraction of pressure that Nesta, had she been watching her father instead of Vera, would have recognized as concern. And at the head of the great table, in the carved oak seat where he had been sitting so still the firelight had nearly absorbed him, the Alpha King moved. Not a large motion. His head turned toward the servant's arch with the slow, weighted rotation of a predator locating a sound. One of his hands lifted from the armrest. A courtier near the fire went rigid. One of Nesta's women stepped back without deciding to. Vera did not see any of it. She was already through the corridor door, bare feet on the back stairs, the second cup of milk steady on the tray. She did not see the way his hand lowered slowly back to the armrest. She did not see the 6 seconds his eyes spent on the empty archway where she had stood. But Nesta did, and Drest did. The corridor door shut. The great hall exhaled. Somewhere above, 4 stories of stone apart, the Pups screamed on. The nursery door opened with a push of her hip. The room was destroyed. Blankets pulled from the cradle and dragged across the floor. A healer's kit overturned in the corner, glass bottles in shards, their contents pooling amber and green on the stone. Candles lit and knocked over and relit and knocked over again. The curtains were torn. A shelf of linens lay scattered across the rug in the pattern of someone who had swept an arm across them in frustration or despair. In the centre of it all, in a cradle built for a prince's children, 2 infants screamed, not cried. The sound at close range was a physical force. It hit Vera's eardrums, dropped through her jaw and settled in her teeth. Asa, the girl, was arched rigid with her fists clenched, her face the colour of raw meat. Eli, the boy, was hoarse. His voice had gone thin and whistling days ago, and now it came out in short, ragged tears of sound that carried the texture of something being pulled apart. 12 days. Their throats must have been raw, their bodies running on nothing but the animal drive to keep signalling distress. Vera set the tray on the side table and knelt beside the cradle. Up close, the smell was sharp. Sweat and sour milk and the metallic bite of wolf pups whose anchors had come loose. A scent the body understood before the brain could name it. Wrong. Something foundational, and wrong. Asa's eyes were clenched shut, her hands white-knuckled around the edges of her blanket. She was 8 months old, and she was holding onto the borders of her own body with everything she had left. Vera reached into the cradle and pressed her forehead against Asa's. She did not decide to do this. Her body did it, the same way her hands had picked the cup off the floor and replaced it without conscious thought. She leaned in and touched her skin to the pups, forehead to forehead, and she hummed. No sound. She had no sound. The hum was vibration only, the muscles of her throat contracting and releasing in a pattern she had not thought about in 14 years. Her mother's lullaby, the one from before the fire. 4 notes, cycling, a melody so simple it barely qualified as music. The vibration passed through bone and skin from Vera's forehead to Asa's. Asa stopped screaming. not a trailing off. The sound cut clean. One moment the room was full of it, and the next it was not. The pup's body unclenched, her fists opened, her back relaxed against the padding, and she opened her eyes. Pale grey, clear, looking directly at Vera. 3 seconds later, Eli went quiet. He did not need the touch. The vibration carried through the cradle frame, through the wood and cloth, and reached him, and the tension released from his body at once. His mouth closed, his eyes opened. He stared at Vera with round, dark irises and both hands still gripping his blanket. The silence in the nursery was so sudden it had weight. It pressed against the walls. It pressed against Vera's chest. She stayed on her knees with her forehead touching Azza's. The pup's hand came up, impossibly small, and closed around a strand of Vera's hair. Pulled it. Held on. Eli made a sound that was nothing like his screaming, a small chirp, a questioning note, directed at the stranger kneeling at the side of his cradle. Vera's eyes burned. Her throat closed around something that was not a sound and not quite a sob. She pressed her forehead harder into Azza's and hummed the 4 notes again, and the pup's grip on her hair tightened, and for the first time in 14 years the silence was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of something arriving. She fed them the milk. 1 cup, shared, still warm enough for the chill of the room. Eli drank half and sneezed and sprayed the rest across Vera's collar. Both pups startled, and Aza's face crumpled with the full-bodied outrage of an 8-month-old who had just been sneezed on and found the experience beneath her dignity. Vera wiped the milk off her neck with her sleeve, resettled Eli, and finished feeding Azza, who kept one hand knotted in Vera's hair through the entire process, with the possessive intensity of someone who had found a thing and had no intention of giving it back. They were asleep within the hour, both of them, breathing in the shallow, steady rhythm of pups, whose bodies had finally received the signal that it was safe to rest. Vera sat on the nursery floor beside the cradle and did not move. She was afraid that if she stood, the screaming would begin again. She was afraid that if she breathed too deeply, whatever had happened would dissolve. Dawn came grey through the nursery windows, and the silence held, through the morning bell, through the noon meal, through the slow creep of afternoon light across the floor. By midday, every servant in the palace was whispering the same sentence. The mute Omega stopped the crying, and by late afternoon, the Alpha King came himself. She heard the corridor empty before she heard him. The steady stream of curious footsteps, servants and courtiers finding excuses to pass the nursery and listen to the impossible quiet, pulled back, receded, went still. The hallway cleared in a matter of seconds, everything retreating to make room for something that had not yet arrived. The doorway darkened. Vera did not look up. She was cross-legged on the floor with Azza dozing in the crook of her left arm, and Eli curled against her right knee. Her throat vibrated with the 4-note pattern. So low it was less a sound in the air and more a tremor in the floorboards. He stood in the doorway and did not enter. His attention was a physical thing. Heat across her shoulders, pressure at the crown of her head, the kind of focus that made the animal part of the brain go flat and still. This was the Alpha King. Every cell in Vera's body registered it before her eyes lifted to confirm. She looked up. He was not what she expected, and he was exactly what she expected, and the contradiction sat in both things being true at once. She had seen him at a distance 100 times, crossing the great hall, riding through the gates, standing on the south balcony during war declarations. At a distance he was what an Alpha King was supposed to be. Tall, dark-haired, built for violence, the kind of man a room reorganized itself around. Up close, standing in a nursery doorway with his arms at his sides, he was a man who had not slept in 12 days and was no longer certain his legs would hold. His eyes were on the pups, not on her. On the pups, who were breathing, who were asleep, who were not screaming. He stood there a long time. Vera counted her own heartbeats because she needed something to count. 47, 48, 49. He did not speak. He did not cross the threshold. He watched the sleeping pups with an expression that held too many things stacked on top of each other. Relief and grief and fury and something else underneath all three that she could not identify. On heartbeat 62, Asa shifted in Vera's arm and whimpered. Vera hummed. The pup settled, his jaw clenched. The muscle in his left cheek jumped hard, and his right hand, hanging at his side, closed into a fist and opened again. He had not decided to do that. She was certain of it. The hand had moved on its own, and the motion carried something the rest of his body was refusing to show. He crossed the room. 4 strides. He knelt, not across from her but beside her, close enough that she could smell pine resin and sword oil, and underneath both the deep cedar smoke musk of an alpha wolf. His hand reached toward Eli. Stopped. Reached again. He touched the pup's forehead with 2 fingers. Careful, precise, the touch of a man who was aware his hands could break things he did not intend to break. And Eli turned his face into the contact and sighed in his sleep. Something happened in Lucan's chest. Vera saw it, the breath that went in and did not come out on time, the blink that lasted a beat too long, the Alpha King of Silvercrown kneeling on a nursery floor with 2 fingers on a sleeping pup's forehead, and his whole body trying not to shake. Then he looked at her. The full weight of it landed. Vera's spine locked from the base to the back of her skull. "Who are you?" Not a question, a statement missing its punctuation. She could not answer. She opened her mouth and the silence was there, where it had always been, filling the space between her tongue and the air. Her throat worked. Nothing came. The silence that had hidden her for 14 years was suddenly not a shelter, but a cage she could not climb out of. His eyes dropped to her throat, to the effort of it, and his expression shifted, a reading, a recalculation, a conclusion drawn from something she had not meant to show. He saw the trying. "You cannot speak." She shook her head, and his expression did not change. No pity, no softening. Just the same level assessment, recalibrating what he was looking at. "But you stopped them." She nodded. He looked at her the way no one in this palace had ever looked at her. Not through her, not past her. At her, the flower on her wrists, the milk stain on her collar where Eli had sneezed, the strand of hair Asa was still gripping in her sleep. He was reading the details, and the details were telling him something, and Vera did not know what it was, but she knew it mattered by the way his breathing changed. "You stay." 2 words. He stood. His knees cracked, both of them, loud enough to hear, and the Alpha King's knees cracking on the way up from a nursery floor was the kind of detail that lodged in a person's memory and refused to leave. "This room is yours now. No one enters without my permission." He turned toward the door, then stopped, turned back. His hand came up and his fingers closed around her wrist, her left wrist, the one cradling Asa, and the contact lasted 2 seconds. His thumb pressed the inside of her wrist where the pulse ran close to the surface, and heat bloomed from the point of contact and spread up her arm, across her chest, and settled behind her ribs. Vera's entire body went still. Not fear. Something older. Something her bones understood before her thoughts could follow. A recognition that had no name in any language she knew. His hand dropped. He stepped back. The control was back on his face, the walls rebuilt, but his breathing was faster than it had been 30 seconds ago, and his right hand was at his side again, opening and closing, opening and closing. He left without another word. In the corridor his footsteps stopped, then started, then stopped again before continuing faster toward the far stairs. Asa stirred. Vera hummed and the pup settled again. The nursery was quiet. The corridor was quiet. The whole east wing was quiet for the first time in 12 days, and Vera sat in the center of it on a cold floor with 2 sleeping pups and hands that would not stop shaking. She lifted her left wrist, the one he had touched, and looked at it. The skin was the same. No mark, no bruise, no visible trace that anything had happened. But the warmth was still there, nested behind her ribs, steady and deep, and when she pressed her thumb to the place where his had been, the warmth pulsed once and held. She did not understand it. She had no word for the thing her body had recognized when his skin met hers, because she had no words at all and never had. But her bones knew. Something old and patient had turned over inside her when his thumb found her pulse, and it had not turned back, and she sat on the nursery floor pressing her own wrist and trying to make sense of a feeling that did not fit inside any silence she had ever carried. The whole day came down on her then, all at once, the way a held breath comes down when the body finally stops holding it. The milk on the floor, Nesta's fingers grinding into her shoulder, the laughter, the 4 flights of stairs and the screaming that never stopped, and the pups who had stopped, who were asleep, who were breathing against her body right now because she had hummed a lullaby she did not remember learning, and the man in the doorway who had looked at her, the flour and the milk stain and the bare feet, and said, "You stay," in a voice that left no room for argument. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever looked at her and decided she was something to keep. Aza's hand tightened in her hair. Eli sighed against her knee. 2 parentless pups curled against a parentless girl on a nursery floor, and the warmth in Vera's chest wrapped around all 3 of them and held. Her throat ached. She opened her mouth, not to speak, because she could not speak, but to test the shape of it, to push air through her throat the way she pushed humming through bone and see if anything came out the other side. A breath, a tremor, something that wanted to be a sound pressing at the base of her throat the way a word presses at the inside of a closed mouth. Not enough. Not yet. The air moved through her and came out silent, and the silence sat in the room with her the way it always had, patient and permanent, and hers. She closed her mouth. She pressed her face into Aza's hair, and her shoulders shook once, twice, a 3rd time. The kind of shaking that came with no sound because she had no sound to give it. The weight of the day was in her chest and in her arms, and in the trembling that moved through her body in waves, and she let it come because there was no one here to see it, and no one to perform composure for. Just the pups and the dark nursery, and the cold creeping in through the stone. She shook until the shaking passed. Then she straightened her back and wiped her face on her sleeve and breathed until her hands went still. The warmth behind her ribs pulsed once and stayed. That evening the steward, a thin, weathered man named Harold who had served Silvercrown since before the purge, arrived with 3 guards and a trunk containing everything Vera owned, 1 spare dress, a wooden comb, and a blanket. The adjoining chamber had been prepared on the king's direct order, which meant clean linens, a fire in the grate, and a lock on the door, luxuries Vera had never seen from the inside of a room she was permitted to sleep in. Harold supervised the arrangement with his hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak to Vera directly, but he left a plate of bread and cold meat on the side table, which was more food than the kitchen dormitory had given her in a day. In the corridor, as the guards secured the wing, Harold paused outside the nursery door. Through the gap, he could see the king. Lucan had returned and was standing beside the cradle, one hand resting on the rail, looking down at the sleeping pups. His shoulders were curved in a way Harold had not seen since the boy was 12 years old and his mother had died. The king did not know he was being watched. His mouth was moving, no sound, or none that carried. And after a moment Harold realized he was counting the pups' breaths. Harold shut the door quietly and stationed the guards on either side. Some things did not require commentary. Magga came at midnight. She did not knock. She pushed the chamber door open with her hip, locked it behind her, and sat on the edge of the bed with both hands pressed flat against her own knees, the gesture she used when her hands needed to be prevented from shaking. Vera was in the chair by the window, Aza dozing against her shoulder. Eli slept in the cradle in the adjoining nursery. The fire crackled. The room was warmer than any room Vera had ever slept in, and the warmth felt borrowed, something that belonged to a person she had not been told she was. "I should have told you years ago." Magga's voice was stripped down to its frame. No warmth, no gruffness, just the words and the weight of them. Vera looked at her. Magga's face was doing something complicated. Her jaw tight, her nostrils flared, the skin around her eyes pulled taut. The face of a woman about to say something that had been pressing against her ribs for 14 years. "Your name is not Vera." Flat, careful, each word placed with deliberate weight. I named you Vera because you needed something to answer to. Your mother called you Elowen. Your mother was Princess Sarah of the Coral House, King Aldric's younger sister, Lucan's father's sister. Vera's hands stopped moving on Aza's back. The pup shifted and made a small sound. Sarah married Lord Ashven of the Coral Line. You were born in the Coral Keep, 3 months before the Purge. Magga's hands pressed harder into her knees. Aldric ordered the entire Coral Line destroyed. Every branch, every child, every record. Vera's fingers curled into the arm of the chair. Your mother's carriage was burned on the northern road while she was fleeing with you and 2 handmaids. I was in the carriage. Magga's voice dropped. I was her baker. Did you know that? Before I made bread for the palace, I made it for her. Vera shook her head. She had not known. She had never asked because Magga had made it clear from the beginning that the burning carriage was a door that stayed shut, and Vera understood doors that stayed shut. The handmaids died. Your mother. Magga stopped. Her jaw worked. She pressed forward. Your mother put you in my arms and told me to run. I ran. She did not. The fire popped. Aza burrowed closer into Vera's neck and made a sound that was half sigh, half complaint about the noise. Vera shook her head, not in response to anything Magga said. A refusal, her body's first answer, arriving before the thought could form. She was a kitchen maid. She was no Magga with no wolf and no voice and flour under her nails. She was not a princess. She was not anyone's cousin. She was furniture. She had been furniture for 14 years, and furniture did not suddenly become something else because an old woman sat on a bed and said so. You are Lucan's first cousin. Magga was not stopping for the refusal. You are the last living blood of the Coral House, and that, she pointed at Aza, asleep on Vera's shoulder, is why you can do what no healer in this kingdom can. Vera's stomach dropped, a physical plunge, sudden enough that she gripped the arm of the chair. She shook her head again, harder. The soul anchor, the bond those pups need, it runs through the maternal bloodline, the coral resonance. Vera looked down at Aza. The pup's hand was still curled against her collarbone. Their mother was Coral, from a different branch. She died bringing them into the world 8 months ago. Their father became their only anchor. Magga's jaw tightened. When Kale died, there was no coral blood left on this continent except you. When you hum to them, you are not soothing them. You are anchoring them. Your blood is doing what their fathers used to do. A third shake of her head. Stubborn, tight, the motion of a body that did not want what was being given to it. Stop shaking your head, girl. I have spent 14 years watching you carry trays through a palace your father helped build, and I am done. Magga's voice cracked on the last word. Just for a moment, she caught it, hauled it back, swallowed it down. Done. The room was quiet except for the fire and the soft rhythm of Aza's breathing. Vera looked down at the pup. Aza's face was slack with sleep, her breathing steady. One small fist curled against Vera's collarbone. 8 months old. Parentless. The fact of it, the simple, terrible fact that this child had no one left, that the only thing keeping her tethered to her own body was Vera's throat vibrating against her skin, settled in Vera's chest beside the warmth that had been there since Lucan touched her wrist. Something shifted. Not in the room. In Vera. She stopped shaking her head. Her spine straightened. Her arms tightened around Aza, not in fear this time, but in something harder and quieter. Aza's fist uncurled against her collarbone, and then curled again, tighter, gripping the fabric of Vera's dress with the blind, certain strength of an infant who had decided this person was hers. And on Vera's left forearm, the arm holding the pup, a mark began to form. It came slowly, silver lines, fine as thread, tracing a branching pattern she had never seen but her body knew, a tree with roots that coiled into waves. The Coral House sigil. She had never been shown it. No one had described it to her. But it was writing itself onto her skin in real time, and her bones ached with the rightness of it. Not pain, but recognition, the deep tissue knowledge of a body remembering what it was made to be. Aza opened her eyes, looked at the mark, reached out with one small hand and traced the silver lines with her finger. Where the pup touched, the lines brightened. There, Magga's voice broke open. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and turned her face to the wall, and her shoulders moved once, hard, the private collapse of a woman who had held 14 years of silence and could not hold it one more second. There it is. I knew it would. Vera sat in the chair with a mark she had not asked for, writing itself onto her arm, and a pup tracing it with her finger, and the complete restructuring of 18 years of identity happening inside her chest without her permission. The world was rearranging itself around a fact that had been true since the night of the fire and hidden for every moment since. She was not an Omega kitchen maid. She was the last daughter of a murdered house, and the only person alive who could keep 2 orphaned pups from following their parents into the dark. She stopped fighting it. The acceptance was not a thought. It was her body, her shoulders dropping, her breath releasing, her hand settling over Aza's where the pup's fingers traced the silver mark. A body that had spent 14 years pretending to be less than it was, exhaling. There is more. Magga turned back. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was controlled again, pressed back into shape by the weight of what came next. I spoke to the court healer before I came up. The pup's anchor is not just broken, it is dissolving. They have a month, perhaps less. Vera's arms tightened around Aza. The only way to make the re-anchoring permanent is a blood moon bond, a formal binding of your bloodline to the royal house, to Lucan. Magga paused. By marriage. She let the word sit in the room. The next blood moon is 14 days away. 14 days. The number landed and stayed. And if the council discovers what you are before the bond is sealed, Magga paused. Councillor Drest oversaw the coral purge personally. He persuaded Aldrich it was necessary. Her hands pressed flat against her knees again. His daughter is the council's chosen queen. If Drest learns that a coral heir survived, housed in the palace, bonded to the pups. She did not finish. She did not need to. If Drest discovered Vera's blood before the marriage bond was sealed, he would petition the council to execute her. Not out of cruelty. Drest was a man whose cruelty had always been structural, procedural, the organized violence of someone who believed the kingdom was a machine, and inconvenient bloodlines were broken gears to be removed. A surviving coral heir was a succession threat. Nestor's position, Drest's authority, the entire political structure of the past 14 years, all of it collapsed if Vera lived and was recognized. 14 days to save 2 pups. 14 days to marry a king she had never spoken to. 14 days before the man who burned her mother's carriage found out she was still breathing. The silver mark on Vera's forearm pulsed once, bright, in perfect time with Aza's heartbeat. The clock started. Magga stayed until she thought Vera had fallen asleep. The old woman pulled a blanket over Vera's shoulders, touched the crown of her head the way she used to when Vera was small enough to sit on the kitchen counter, and left. The lock clicked behind her. Vera opened her eyes. The room was dark except for the dying fire and the silver glow of the mark on her forearm. She sat in the chair with a sleeping pup on her shoulder and the name Elowen inside her head, and she turned it over, the way you turn a stone in your hands, feeling for its weight and edges. Elowen. Her mother had called her Elowen, a woman named Sarah, a princess, who had put her baby in a baker's arms and told her to run and stayed behind in a burning carriage on a northern road. Vera had no memory of her. She had tried, over the years, lying in the kitchen dormitory at night, pressing her eyes shut, reaching for any scrap of the life before Magga and the flower and the back stairs. Nothing ever came. The earliest thing she could hold was Magga's hands pulling dough on a wooden table, and the smell of bread, and the sound of an oven ticking. Everything before that was black, and she had long ago stopped reaching into the black because reaching hurt more than not knowing. But her body remembered things her mind could not. That was the part she could not argue with and could not set aside. Her body had pressed its forehead to a stranger's pup and hummed a lullaby it had no business knowing. Her arm had written a sigil nobody had ever shown her, and the recognition she had felt when Lucan's thumb found her pulse, That deep, ancient turning over in her bones had not been random. It was bloodline. It was the choral resonance answering the Silvercrown line the way it had been answering for centuries before a king decided to burn it out of the world. She was not furniture. She had never been furniture. She was a girl who had been hidden inside the shape of furniture to keep her alive, and the hiding had worked so well that she had believed it herself. And the wolf she had never had, the absence that had marked her as less than every servant in the palace, the hollow they whispered about when they thought she could not hear, was not an absence at all. The coral line did not carry wolves. They carried the resonance that kept wolves alive. Vera lifted her free hand and held it in front of her face. Kitchen hands, flower-rough, short-nailed, chapped from years of winter water, the hands of a scullion. But the silver mark ran from her forearm to her wrist now, and the light of it picked out the lines of her fingers, and in the dying glow of the fire she looked at her own hand and saw it for the first time in 18 years. She opened her mouth. Not a test this time. An effort. She pushed air through her throat, through the passage that had been sealed since the night of the fire, and strained against the silence with everything her body could give. A sound came. Not a word. A croak, raw and broken, air scraping across vocal cords that had not been used in 14 years. It lasted half a second, thin and ugly, and barely louder than the fire's crackling, and then her throat seized shut, and the silence rushed back in and the sound was gone. But it had been there. For half a second, her body had made a sound that was not humming. Somewhere underneath 14 years of silence, her voice was not dead. It was buried, and it was pushing up. She pressed her hand to her throat. She breathed. She did not try again. Not tonight. But she held that half second of sound inside her chest, the way she held the warmth from Lucan's touch, carefully, like something that could not survive rough handling. Asa shifted on her shoulder and murmured something in her sleep, and Vera pulled the blanket higher around the pup's small body and sat in the dark with a new name and a silver mark dimming to a pulse on her skin, and a voice she had not heard since she was 4 years old, and she did not sleep for a long time. The first 3 days were quiet. Too quiet, Vera thought, which was a thought she had never expected to have after 12 days of screaming. But the quiet had a texture to it, the brittle, pressurized stillness of a court watching a mute Omega kitchen maid tend the royal pups and trying to decide what it meant. She kept to the nursery. She hummed. She fed the pups, bathed them, slept beside the cradle when they slept, and walked the floor with them when they woke. Asa had decided that Vera's hair was her personal property and screamed, not the untethering scream, just the offended scream of an 8-month-old denied her favorite thing, whenever Vera tried to tie it back. Eli was quieter. He watched. He watched everything, with dark, round eyes that tracked movement across the room with an intensity that made Vera wonder if he was going to be a very serious child or a very dangerous one, or, given his bloodline, probably both. Lucan came twice a day, morning and evening without announcement, standing in the doorway for 5 minutes or 50 and leaving without explanation. He never spoke to Vera beyond single-word instructions. Eat, when she forgot, and sleep, when the shadows under her eyes deepened. But he came. Every morning and every evening without fail, he stood in the doorway and watched the pups breathe, and each time he left, the room held something it had not held before. Warmer air, maybe, or the lingering weight of a man who could not cross the threshold, but could not stop returning to it. On the second evening, Asa needed changing, and Eli was fussing, and Vera could not hold both pups and reach the linens at the same time. She looked at Lucan in the doorway and held Asa out toward him. He did not move. Vera raised an eyebrow, the dry, silent commentary of a woman who had spent 14 years communicating without words and had gotten very precise about what her face could say when her throat could not. Lucan looked at the pup in her outstretched arms. He looked at his own hands, and something crossed his face that she had never seen on the Alpha King before, and suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. Uncertainty, not the political kind, not the strategic kind, the raw, unarmored uncertainty of a man who had commanded armies and held a kingdom together through 3 wars, and did not know how to pick up a baby. "Show me." 2 words, spoken at roughly the volume and enthusiasm of a man requesting directions to his own execution. Vera shifted Eli to her hip, crossed the room and took Lucan's left arm. His muscles locked under her fingers. She could feel the tension running through his forearm, through his bicep, all the way up to his shoulder, the rigid readiness of a body that had been trained to hold a sword steady on a battlefield, and was now applying that identical discipline to the problem of not crushing an infant. She bent his elbow to the right angle, positioned his wrist, and placed Asa in the crook of his arm, guiding the pup's head into the hollow above his wrist and settling her weight against his chest. Asa looked up at her uncle. She studied his face with the grave, unblinking intensity of an 8-month-old conducting a thorough evaluation, and the evaluation appeared to take several seconds, during which Lucan did not breathe. Then Asa reached out and grabbed his thumb. His chest expanded with a breath he had been holding since Vera put the pup in his arms. Asa pulled on the thumb, got it into her mouth and bit down with 2 milk teeth and absolutely no mercy. He flinched, the first involuntary movement Vera had ever seen from the Alpha King, a small, startled jerk of his hand that he corrected instantly, and then he looked down at the pup who was chewing on his thumb with her entire body committed to the task, and the expression that crossed his face undid something in Vera's chest that she had not known was locked. She had seen him in command. She had seen him in grief, standing in the nursery doorway with too many things stacked behind his eyes. But she had not seen this, the unguarded wonder of a man holding a child for the first time, and discovering that the child was not afraid of him, that the child had in fact decided he was edible and was investigating this theory with the full commitment of her species. Asa gnawed. Lucan held still, and the rigid control that he carried in every muscle of his body released. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough that his shoulders dropped a fraction and his breathing changed, and the hard line of his jaw softened into something that was not quite a smile, but lived in the same territory. Vera turned away. She had to, because the warmth behind her ribs was expanding into something that pressed against the inside of her chest and threatened to crack through her composure entirely. She busied herself with Eli, changing him, settling him, keeping her hands occupied and her face pointed at the wall while the sounds behind her told the rest of the story. Asa making a wet, satisfied noise, Lucan exhaling, and then a silence that was different from his usual silences. Softer, less controlled. The silence of a man whose chest had released something it had been gripping. When she turned back, he was looking at Asa the way he had looked at both pups from the doorway for 2 days, except the distance was gone. The pup was in his arms and his face was open and unguarded, and full of something he would never say out loud, and Vera stood across the room holding Eli and felt the warmth behind her ribs settle into a shape she recognized, and the recognition hit her so hard that her breath caught. She crossed the room and held out her arms for Asa. Their fingers touched during the transfer, brief, accidental, the backs of his knuckles brushing her palm, and the heat that jumped between their hands was immediate and sharp, and neither of them acknowledged it. Lucan stepped back. His control reassembled itself piece by piece, and by the time he reached the doorway he was the Alpha King again, composed, unreadable, except for the 2 small puncture marks on his thumb where Asa's milk teeth had left their assessment. He said, "Good night," in a voice that sounded like he had swallowed gravel, and he left. Vera sat on the floor with both pups and pressed her forehead into Asa's hair and closed her eyes. The warmth behind her ribs was not settling down. It was not going to settle down, and the 14 days on the clock had nothing to do with it. The servants brought food but did not enter the room. The Queen Dowager sent a note. Vera could not read the handwriting, but the steward Harold translated it as congratulations, and a request not to be disturbed until the smell of sage cleared from her chambers, which might take until spring. The court healer visited daily to examine the pups, pressing 2 fingers to each small chest and listening for the soul anchor's resonance, and each time he looked at Vera afterward with an expression she could not read. On the 3rd night, the quiet broke. It began with a kitchen girl who brought Vera's evening meal, and left it outside the door with the plate pushed as far from the threshold as her arm could reach. "Lady Nesta says you bewitched the pups." The girl spoke to the air beside Vera's head, not to Vera herself. "She says kitchen witchcraft is the only explanation. She told the council this morning." Councillor Drest listened. The girl left. Vera picked up the plate and stood in the doorway holding it, and her stomach knotted. Kitchen witchcraft. The kind of accusation that could not be disproven because it was never specific enough to refute. Nesta was smart. She had not said coral blood. She did not know. She had said witchcraft, which was vaguer and more dangerous, a charge that could be stretched to justify removing Vera from the nursery. By the fourth morning, the servants stopped bringing food at all. Harold brought it himself, without comment, and stationed one of his own men outside the nursery door to ensure it arrived. He did not explain this. He did not discuss it. He simply appeared with a tray and a guard, and the expression of a man who had served Silvercrown long enough to recognize the opening moves of a political campaign, and was not inclined to watch it succeed. Vera ate. She hummed to the pups. She did not leave the room. The hallway outside the nursery had developed a population. Servants who lingered too long, courtiers who passed too slowly, and once, in the early hours of the fifth morning, a member of Nesta's personal guard who stood outside the door for 90 minutes doing nothing at all, which was the most threatening kind of nothing there was. On the fifth night, Lucan came for his evening visit and found the guard's boot prints still visible in the dust outside the nursery door. He said nothing about it to Vera. He stood in the doorway, looked at the prints, looked at the sleeping pups, and his expression did not change. But when he left, his stride was different, longer, harder, the walk of a man who had finished weighing options and landed on one. The next morning, the boot prints were gone, and so was the guard. But Nesta had already made her next move. The council has requested a formal examination of the pups. Harold delivered this at dawn on the sixth day with the careful neutrality of a man reading words he had not written and did not endorse. He stood in the nursery doorway with his hands clasped, his face blank, and a tightness around his eyes that said everything his voice did not. Councillor Drest has petitioned for an independent healer to assess whether the pup's improvement is medically sound or... He paused. The result of unauthorized intervention. Unauthorized intervention. A polished way of saying witchcraft. A political way of saying, we want her out. Vera was on the floor with both pups in her lap. Arza was awake and chewing on the collar of Vera's dress with deep concentration. Eli was asleep with his head on her knee. The silver mark on Vera's forearm, which she had kept hidden under her sleeve since the night it appeared, pulsed faintly beneath the fabric. 8 days until the blood moon. Harold waited. Vera looked at him. She could not speak, but her face asked the question clearly enough. Tomorrow morning, the Great Hall. Another pause. Councillor Drest has requested the examination be conducted publicly, for transparency. Publicly, in the Great Hall, the same room where Nesta had poured milk on the floor and the court had laughed. Harold left. Vera sat with the pups and pressed her forehead against Aza's hair and breathed. That evening Lucan came. He did not stand in the doorway. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee beside her, and spoke in a voice she had not heard from him before, low, fast, stripped of the control that held his public words in place. I am going to stop it. She shook her head. Do not shake your head at me. Drest is using the examination to build grounds for your removal. Vera's hands went still on the pups' backs. If the healer rules the recovery is not natural, and Drest will make sure of that because Drest selects the healers, they will take you from this room. The pups go back to standard care, and they die. She knew all of it. Her stomach was stone. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against her knees the way she had watched Magga press hers, holding them still by force. I can override the council. I am the king. He stopped. His hand closed on his own knee. But if I override Drest now, before the bond, he will investigate why. And if he finds out what you are... His jaw locked. He looked at the pups, then at her, and the war on his face. The visible physical battle between the king who could command and the man who could not protect. was the most honest thing she had ever seen from him. "I need you to leave the palace tonight. I will send guards. The northern border." "No," she mouthed it. Her lips formed the shape, her throat tried, and the sound did not come. But the force of the word was in her eyes, and in the set of her jaw, and in the way her arms tightened around both pups. No, she was not leaving. Not the pups, who would die without her. Not the palace where her mother had lived before her. Not the room that smelled of warm milk and two small bodies that had finally stopped screaming. Lucan stared at her. His hand came up, stopped, came up again, and this time it did not reach for the pups. It reached toward her face. His fingers hovered a breath from her cheek, and then curled back into his palm, pulled back by a restraint she could see costing him. "You will not go." She shook her head. A sound came out of him, not a word, not a laugh, something between the two that had no translation. He dropped his chin to his chest. His shoulders rose and fell once. When he lifted his head, the expression was the one she had seen in the doorway on the first night. Too many things stacked together, pressing down. "Then we do not give them a reason to look." He stood. "Tomorrow, in the great hall, you do exactly as the healer instructs. You answer every test. You give them nothing they can use." He paused at the door. "I will be there." He left. His boots in the corridor. Steady this time. No stopping. Vera sat with the pups, and her heart hammered against her ribs, and her hands shook, and the silver mark on her arm glowed faintly through her sleeve. She did not sleep that night. She spent it on the nursery floor with both pups against her chest, humming the four-note pattern until her throat was raw. Asa slept deep and still. Eli woke twice, fussing, and both times Vera felt it before he cried, a tug behind her ribs, a flicker in the warmth that connected them, a thread straining. Near dawn, Eli spiked a fever. It came fast. One moment his skin was cool and his breathing steady. The next he was burning, his small body radiating heat that soaked through Vera's dress and into her skin, and his eyes, open, unfocused, were wrong. The dark irises had gone cloudy, a milky film, thin as breath on glass, spreading across the surface. The soul anchor was weakening. She could feel it, the connection between her and the pups. The invisible resonance her humming sustained was fraying, thinning. Eli's end of it was pulling loose, and his body was answering the loss the only way it could. She hummed harder, pressed her forehead to his. The fever did not break, but it stabilized, hovering at a plateau instead of climbing, and the clouding in his eyes receded, enough that the dark iris was visible again underneath. 1 month, the healer had said, but that was 6 days ago, and Eli's anchor was already failing. The court healer came at first light. He examined Eli with careful hands and a face that gave nothing away, pressed his ear to the pup's chest, listened, and straightened. "The anchor is degrading faster than I projected." His voice was quiet, precise, a man delivering information he wished he did not have. "The rebonding must happen within 8 days or the male pup will untether first. The female has more time, perhaps 10 days, perhaps less." 8 days. The blood moon was in 7. The healer looked at Vera, at the edge of her sleeve where the faint silver glow pulsed with Aza's heartbeat. He had seen it. She knew he had seen it. His expression, the unreadable one she had noticed every day this week, resolved into something she could finally identify. He knew. He had known for days. "Whatever you are doing," he said, "do not stop." He left for the great hall to deliver his report to the council. Vera pulled her sleeve down over the mark, picked up both pups, and looked at the nursery door. She had been in this room for 6 days, hiding, waiting, letting Dressed come to her, while Nesta set the board, letting the clock tick while she sat on the floor and hummed and hoped the palace would forget she existed. That was the kitchen Vera, the furniture Vera, and she was done being her. She washed her face. She tied back her hair. Aza screamed, and Vera untied it again, because some battles were not worth fighting even on the morning of a public examination. She changed into the clean dress Haral had left, settled both pups in the carrying cloth the healer had provided, and walked to the door. Harold was outside. 2 guards flanked him. He looked at her, looked at the pups, and the corner of his mouth moved approximately 1/8 of an inch in a direction that could generously be called a smile. She mouthed the words, "The Great Hall." He nodded. This way. The power came in the corridor outside the Great Hall, not the Great Hall itself, the stone passage before it, where the morning light fell through narrow windows and the noise of the gathered court leaked through the double doors. Vera was walking with Haral 2 steps ahead, and the guards flanking, and both pups against her chest, and the mark on her arm began to burn. Not the gentle pulse she had grown used to, a burn, deep, structural, radiating from her forearm through her shoulder and into her chest. The warmth that had lived behind her ribs since Lucan touched her wrist expanded, flooded, filled her torso and ran down her arms and gathered in her hands. Her palms tingled. Her fingertips went hot. She stopped walking. Arza looked up at her with wide grey eyes. Eli, still warm from the fever, still fighting the clouding, turned his face into her chest and pressed his ear against her heartbeat. The hum rose, not the vibration-only hum she had produced for 14 years. Sound, a sound that came from her throat and travelled through the air and existed outside her body for the first time since she was 4 years old. Low, steady, the 4-note pattern her mother had sung, and the quality of it was silver. She could feel it the way she could feel temperature, a property of the vibration that her blood recognized as its own. Harold turned. His eyes widened. The mark on her forearm blazed through her sleeve. Silver light visible through the fabric, tracing the branching tree. The same light bloomed on Arza's small hand where it rested against Vera's arm, on Eli's forehead, where it pressed against her heartbeat. 3 points of light, Vera, Arza, Eli, connected by something visible and undeniable. The soul anchor, not hummed into existence, not sustained by effort, alive, self-renewing, a bond that was rewriting itself in real time, replacing the dead father's thread with one rooted in Vera's blood. Eli's fever broke. She felt it go, a release of heat, a tension dissolving, the milky cloud clearing from his eyes as if it had been wiped clean. He blinked, looked up at her. His eyes were clear and dark and sharp, and he opened his mouth and made a sound, not a cry, not a chirp, but a single clear note that matched the frequency of her hum. Vera's throat opened wider. The sound grew. The same passage that had given her a half-second croak in the dark room after Magga's revelation was cracking open further, and this time it did not cease shut. This time the air moved through and kept moving, and the sound that poured out of her was not a croak or a gasp, but her mother's melody, whole and steady and travelling through the stone corridor for the first time in 14 years. She heard her own voice. The sound of it reached her ears and her knees went soft and her vision blurred, and for a moment the corridor tilted, and the only things holding her upright were the 2 pups pressed against her chest. She had not heard this sound since she was 4 years old. She had forgotten what it was. The texture of it, the specific rough grain of her own voice pushing through air and reaching a space beyond her body. It was thin and scraped raw by years of disuse, and it cracked on the higher notes, and it was the most whole thing she had ever heard. Harold stood in the corridor with both hands at his sides and his face completely still, and he said, very quietly, "You are Coral." Vera looked at him. She opened her mouth and the sound was there, present, available, fragile as new skin over an old burn, trembling with the effort of holding itself together. "Yes," she said, 1 syllable, rough and cracked and barely above a whisper, but it travelled through the air and reached another person's ears and was understood, and that single word held 14 years of silence breaking open inside it. Her eyes burned. Her throat ached from the effort, raw and tender and alive. She pressed her mouth against Azza's hair to keep herself together, because the pups were watching her with wide eyes, and Harold was watching her from the corridor, and the great hall was waiting on the other side of those doors, and she could not fall apart in this hallway with 7 days left on the clock. Not yet, not now, but her voice was back, broken, scarred, barely functional, and back. The fear did not leave. It sat in her stomach where it had been for 6 days. But it was smaller now, and the rest of her, the blood, the voice, the warmth, the silver light connecting her to 2 pups who needed her, was so much larger. She adjusted Azza against her chest, wiped Eli's face with the edge of her sleeve and pulled her shoulders back. "Open the doors," she said. The great hall was the same room it had been 12 nights ago, when Nesta poured milk on the floor and the court laughed. Every seat was filled. The full council occupied the high table, dressed at its centre, white-haired and composed, his hands folded, his face the mask of a man who had orchestrated the morning and expected it to proceed exactly as arranged. Nesta sat at his right, the court witch at his left. 6 councillors flanked them. Household guards lined the walls. Courtiers and servants filled the benches and spilled into the aisles. The entire population of the Silvercrown Palace had gathered for the examination of the mute Omega, who had stopped the pups crying. At the head of the table, in the mountain oak seat, the Alpha King sat with one hand on the armrest and his eyes on the doors. Vera walked in. The room went quiet. Not the gradual fade of dying conversations. A cut, clean and total, the same way Aza's screaming had cut to silence in the nursery 12 nights ago. 200 wolves looked at a barefoot woman in a kitchen dress carrying 2 pups against her chest, and every voice in the room stopped at the same moment. She walked to the centre of the floor, the same stone where Nesta's milk had pooled and dried, the same spot where she had knelt to pick up the cup. Dressed spoke first. His voice was measured, precise, the voice of a man chairing a proceeding, not participating in one. "The council has requested a formal examination of the pup's condition. An independent healer has been—" "The healer is not needed," Vera's voice, in the great hall, rough and cracked and thin and unmistakable. The room did not breathe. Nesta stood. Her chair scraped stone. "She speaks. The mute speaks." She turned to the council. "She has been deceiving the entire palace for—" "Sit down, Nesta." Lucan. 2 words. His voice was not loud, but it crossed the hall without diminishing. Nesta sat. Vera looked at Dressed, the man who had burned her mother's carriage, the man who had convinced a king that an entire bloodline was something to be removed. He looked back at her with the face of a man whose mourning was no longer going according to plan. 12 nights ago, Lady Nesta poured a cup of milk on this floor and told me I could not help the pups because I was nothing. Vera's voice shook. She let it shake. It was her voice, and it was broken, and it was real, and the room could hear every crack in it. She was wrong about the milk. She was wrong about me. She pulled back her sleeve. The silver mark blazed. In the morning light of the great hall, the coral sigil on her forearm was visible from the high table to the back wall, a branching tree with roots that coiled into waves, glowing bright enough to cast faint shadows on the stone. Aza's hand rested on the mark, and where the pup's fingers touched, the light intensified. Eli's forehead pressed to Vera's chest, and the same silver glow burned at the point of contact. 3 lights, 3 points. The soul anchor, visible and alive, connecting a woman and 2 pups in front of 200 witnesses. No one moved. The silver light pulsed in time with Aza's heartbeat, and 200 wolves watched it, and the only sound in the hall was breathing. A guard near the door lowered his hand from his sword hilt. A courtier on the second bench pressed her fingers to her mouth. The light was not a trick and not a spell, and every wolf in the room could feel the resonance humming through the stone beneath their feet, the deep, blood-level vibration of a bond that was older than politics and could not be faked. Dressed stood. The composure cracked, a hairline fracture, visible in the way his hands unclenched and then reclenched, in the way his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet. This is coral blood. This is a coral heir. He turned to the council. The coral line was eliminated 14 years ago by royal decree. If this woman is what the mark suggests, she is the king's cousin. Magga's voice, from the back of the hall. The old baker had not been invited. She had come anyway, walking through the crowd with flour on her apron and 14 years of silence burning behind her eyes. She is Princess Sarah's daughter. I pulled her from a burning carriage on the northern road, a carriage your men set on fire dressed, on your order. The hall turned, every head, every pair of eyes rotating from the silver-marked woman in the centre of the floor to the old baker at the back of the room to the white-haired counsellor at the high table. Drest's face went rigid, not with guilt. Vera saw that clearly, even from across the room. Calculation. The rapid, visible restructuring of a man whose arrangements were collapsing and who was already building the next one. He raised his hand. 2 fingers, extended toward the household guards along the far wall, a gesture so small and so practiced that Vera almost missed it. She did not miss the result. 3 guards stepped forward from the wall, hands on their hilts, and the hall's attention split between the silver-marked woman in the centre of the floor and the armed men walking toward her. Vera's arms tightened around the pups. Asa whimpered. The silver light flickered. The purge was a lawful action ordered by a reigning king. Drest's voice carried the calm of a man who had performed this kind of removal before and expected it to proceed the same way it always had. This woman, if she is what the baker claims, is a surviving threat to the established succession, and I am exercising the council's authority to detain her until her bloodline can be independently verified. The 3 guards were 10 paces from Vera. 8, 6. The council has the authority to protect the crown. Lucan stood. The 3 guards stopped. Not slowly. They stopped the way every wolf in a room stops when the alpha speaks. A full-body lock that is not a choice but a response. The room rearranged itself around Lucan's movement. Courtiers leaned back. Nesta's 2 women stepped away from the high table, and the guards who had been walking toward Vera turned their faces to their king and did not take another step. The crown is the pups. Their anchor is dissolving. Without her, they die within the week. He looked at Drest, and his voice changed, dropped below command, below control, into something Vera had not heard from him before. The raw, unmanaged sound of a man who had spent 12 days listening to infants scream themselves hoarse, and 2 weeks grieving a brother he could not bury properly, and had reached the end of what he could contain. My brother's children, Drest, Kale's children, the last of him that exists in this world, and you are standing in this hall asking me to let them die so your daughter can be queen. The silence that followed was not the silence of a court waiting. It was the silence of a court hearing. Nesta's face went white, not from Lucan's words, from what was visible behind them. Vera saw it happen, the exact moment, readable in the way Nesta's eyes changed. The woman who had poured milk on the floor and laughed, who had maneuvered and positioned and waited 3 years for a proposal that never came. Nesta looked at the Alpha King standing beside a barefoot kitchen maid, and every person in the hall could see the same thing Vera could see. He had never once looked at Nesta the way he was looking at Vera right now. The arrangement had been her father's, and Nesta was seeing that clearly, perhaps for the first time, in a room full of witnesses. Her hands dropped to her sides, her chin lifted. The composure held barely, but underneath it something shifted, visible in the way her breathing changed, in the way her shoulders pulled inward, in the way she looked at her father, and the look was not loyalty. It was exhaustion. Drest turned to the council. This is the succession. The succession is mine to decide. Lucan stepped down from the high table, crossed the floor, stood beside Vera in the centre of the hall on the same stone where she had knelt to pick up a milk cup 12 nights ago, and faced the room. This woman is Elowen of the Coral House. She is my cousin and the pup's blood anchor. She will be bound to the Silvercrown line under the next blood moon, as my mate and queen, with the full protection of the crown. The room held its breath. Mate, queen. The words reached Vera's ears and kept travelling, through her skull, down her spine, into the stone floor beneath her bare feet. She had woken up 6 days ago in a kitchen dormitory. She had carried a tray of milk up the back stairs because no one else would go, and now the Alpha King of Silvercrown was standing beside her in front of 200 witnesses and calling her his queen, and her body could not find a place to put the enormity of it. The word queen did not fit inside the same woman who had been called the Mute, who had picked a cup of milk off a stone floor, who owned one dress and a wooden comb and had no shoes. But the pups were warm against her chest, and the mark on her arm was pulsing, and the man beside her was trembling, and none of those things were about a crown. They were about a nursery on the 4th floor and a lullaby, and 2 small bodies that had stopped screaming because she stayed. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. His face was the controlled mask of the Alpha King, but his hand, his right hand hanging at his side, was trembling. She reached out and took it. His fingers closed around hers. The warmth flared between them, behind her ribs, along her arm, through the anchor to the pups, and the great hall, every wolf in it, saw the light that bloomed where their hands met. Drest opened his mouth and closed it again without a word. "Counselor." The court healer, standing near the bench by the cold fireplace, spoke for the first time. His voice was even and clinical and utterly final. "I have examined the pups daily for 12 days, and the anchor between this woman and the children is the most stable bond I have observed in 40 years of practice. Whatever political concerns the council may hold, the medical reality is that these pups will die without her." He looked at Drest. "That is not an opinion. That is a diagnosis." Drest looked at the healer, at Magga, at the 200 wolves watching him from every bench and aisle, at his daughter, who was no longer looking at him. Everything he had arranged for 14 years was falling, and every person in the room could see it. "I move," said a councillor from the far end of the table, a woman named Bren, silver-haired, who had been quiet all morning, "to accept the king's claim and dissolve the standing betrothal arrangement." "Seconded," said another. Drest looked down the length of the table at the council he had built and held for 14 years. One by one they looked back at him, and one by one their eyes slid away, not in shame, but in decision. Hands rose, Bren's first, then 3 more in quick succession, then 2 more, until 6 of the 8 councillors sat with their palms raised and their faces turned toward the silver light still pulsing in the centre of the hall. The vote was not close, and Drest watched every hand go up. Vera stood in the centre of the great hall with the Alpha King's hand around hers, and the pups glowing against her chest, and one by one the wolves in the room lowered their heads. Not a bow, something older, a recognition. The servants at the back of the hall, the courtiers on the benches, the guards along the walls. Haral, standing near the door with his hands clasped, his face still blank, his chin dipping. Even Nesta, not fully, her jaw was locked and her eyes were bright and her hands were fists at her sides, but her chin dropped, a fraction, and she exhaled, and the sound of it was the sound of something being set down after being carried too long. Drest did not kneel. He stood at the high table with his hands at his sides and his face grey and still. Vera looked at him, the man who had burned her mother's carriage, the man who had told a king to destroy a bloodline to protect a machine. He was old. He was beaten. The hall was waiting for her to call for his head. "Exile," she said. Her voice was rough and thin and the word cracked in the middle. Not death. Exile. Drest stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not gratitude, not relief. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had underestimated the lowest thing in the room and was standing now in the wreckage of that mistake. He walked out of the great hall without escort, without ceremony. Through a path the crowd opened for him in silence. His boots on the stone, the door closing behind him. Vera's knees buckled. Lucan caught her, one arm around her waist, pulling her up, and the pups pressed between them. Azza's hand still tangled in Vera's hair, Eli's face still pressed to her heartbeat, and for a moment the 4 of them stood in the centre of the great hall, held together by grip and light, and a bond the room could see and could not deny. "You were supposed to leave when I told you to leave," Lucan said. His voice was low. His arm was shaking. "No," Vera said. His head dropped. His forehead touched hers. And in front of 200 witnesses, the Alpha King exhaled, a sound that was not a word and not a sob, but something between the two that had no name. And his hand came up and cradled the back of her head and held her there. 1 year later, the blood moon ceremony was a memory, a night of silver light and binding words that Vera recalled in fragments, the weight of a crown she had not expected, the heat of Lucan's hand, the sound of Aza's laugh echoing off the ceremonial hall's ceiling. It was the first time anyone had heard the child laugh, and it had disrupted the ritual so thoroughly that the officiating priestess had to start the binding chant from the beginning. Lucan had looked at the ceiling, then at Aza, then at Vera, and the expression on his face, the baffled, helpless surrender of a man watching an 8-month-old dismantle a sacred ceremony with one sound, was something Vera kept in the center of her chest and planned to keep there forever. The Coral Purge Memorial stood in the Eastern Gardens, a stone circle bearing the names of every person killed. Lucan had ordered it built within a week of the ceremony, without asking permission, without announcement. He had asked for Vera's hand, which he held while they read the names together. Her mother's name was the last one carved, and Vera had stood in the garden with her free hand pressed against the stone, and the silence she held then was not the old silence, not absence, not the lowest rank. It was the silence of someone saying goodbye to a woman she would never remember, and choosing to carry her forward anyway. Magga still baked the bread. She had refused every offer of promotion, relocation, or retirement with the same flat sentence: "I am the palace baker, and I will die the palace baker, and you can put that in whatever decree you like." She had, however, accepted a room with a window, the first in 30 years, which she claimed she did not care about while keeping fresh flowers on the sill every morning. Nesta had gone north. Not exile, choice. She had left Silvercrown within a month of the council vote, taking 2 handmaids and a sealed letter from Lucan that Vera had not asked about, and Lucan had not offered to explain. Whatever was in it, Nesta had nodded when she read it, and the nod had been the nod of a woman being released from something she had carried longer than she wanted. Word came from the Northern Territories that she was managing a trading post, that she was good at it, that she had not once mentioned the palace. The pups were walking, badly, joyfully, with the careening determination of toddlers who had recently discovered that legs existed, and were furious they had not been informed sooner. Aza walked into Walls. Eli walked into Aza. Both of them walked into Lucan at every opportunity, because their uncle had made the tactical error of sitting on the floor with them once, and they had correctly identified him as the largest and most satisfying obstacle in any room. The Council of Silvercrown had passed 4 new laws in the year since Vera's recognition. First, that no Omega, regardless of rank or voice or wolf status, could be denied shoes, meals, or sleeping quarters within any palace or great house. Second, that no bloodline could be declared extinct by royal order. Third, that any wolf-born child whose soul anchor was broken had the right to be matched with a blood-kin re-anchor before any other political consideration could be raised. Fourth, that the back stairs of Silvercrown Palace would be widened by 2 feet, because Vera had carried trays up them for 12 years, and they were, in the precise words of the Queen's formal petition to the Construction Guild, unreasonably narrow and an insult to anyone carrying a hot beverage. On a morning in early autumn, Vera sat in the nursery, the same cradle, though the walls had been repainted and the torn curtains replaced, and nursed her daughter. The baby was 3 weeks old and already had Lucan's dark hair, and Vera's grey eyes and the coral mark, silver and faint, tracing itself along the inside of her left wrist. Aza sat on the floor beside the chair, holding a wooden wolf that Harold had carved. Eli sat beside Aza, holding Aza's foot, because he had decided that Aza's foot was more interesting than any toy in the room, and no force in the kingdom would change his mind. Lucan leaned in the doorway. He was watching them. He did not know she was watching him back. His hand at his side was still, not opening and closing, not clenched, still. Vera hummed, the 4-note pattern, her mother's lullaby, delivered in a voice that was rough and imperfect and scarred from 14 years of silence and would never be smooth. The baby turned her face toward the sound and closed her eyes. Aza leaned against Vera's knee. Eli chewed on Aza's toe, and Aza did not seem to mind. The Alpha King's twin pups had not cried in a year. They had, on one memorable occasion, both screamed simultaneously when Magga's bread delivery was 10 minutes late, which caused 3 guards to draw weapons before it was established that the emergency was a shortage of toast. Lucan had quietly doubled the morning bread order after that. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The nursery was warm. The fire was low. The morning light came through the windows and fell across the floor in long gold bands, and in the chair by the cradle, with 3 children around her, and a scarred voice humming a lullaby from a life she barely remembered, Vera rested. She was the Omega Maid who had slipped into the royal nursery with milk, and the Alpha King's twin pups had stopped crying for the first time in 12 days. Some silences are not the lowest rank at all. Some silences are the sound a palace makes when it is finally at peace. If you are listening to this in the dark, alone, with the day still sitting heavy on your chest, I hope this was good company. Sleep well. If this story found you tonight, subscribe so the next one finds you too.